name is Chris Watt, and I have produced this 15-minute film in honour of my great-great-uncle Robert Cooper Greenaway. Robert had a brother, Leonard, who also fought in the war and was evacuated to England with wounds to his left arm. However, this is Robert's story. My mother's name was Peggy Watt, born Noon, and her father was Lyle Francis Noon. His mother was Charlotte Lavina Noon, born Greenaway, and her brother was Robert Cooper Greenaway. Robert Cooper Greenaway was born in Colongaluk, New South Wales in 1888. He attended Nabiac Public School, where his name is immortalised on the memorial plaque. Robert also was the first ANZAC who attended Nabiac Public School, killed in World War I. He was part of the congregation at St Paul's Anglican Church, Nabiac, and again his name can be found on the memorial in remembrance at Nabiac of those served during World War I. When war was declared in 1914, Robert was employed as a fireman and answered the call to service travelling to Liverpool, Sydney, where he enlisting in the 13th Battalion on the 6th of November 1914. From there he travelled to Melbourne and embarked on the transport ship Ulysses on the 22nd of December 1914, bound for Egypt. After 4 months training, the 13th Battalion left Alexandria to join the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force Gallipoli 12th of April 1915. And so we come to Gallipoli. In the early hours of the 25th of April 1915, men of the 3rd Brigade ANZAC Corps were the first to be landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, led by Major E.G. Sinclair McLaughlin. The overall objective was to cross the heights of Gallipoli and to allow Allied ships to pass through the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople, now Istanbul, and ultimately knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war. From the battleships anchored offshore, the men of the 13th Battalion 4th Brigade waited impatiently, knowing their mates were involved in the opening fierce exchanges with the Turkish defenders as they attempted to capture the heights, 3 ridges from ANZAC Cove. Despite difficulties, including with terrain and Turkish soldiers, the ANZACs continued to land more men from the 1st and 2nd Brigades. The ANZACs scrambled up the narrow ravines and gullies, driving the Turkish soldiers back. However, by the end of that first day, the ANZACs suffered some 2,000 casualties. The 4th Brigade, under the command of Colonel John Monash, including Robert's 13th Battalion, made their way down the ladders to the landing craft in that late afternoon on that first day, and by 6 p.m. had stepped ashore. They were not able to land the whole battalion until early hours. As Robert sat in his position in the landing craft, slowly making his way to ANZAC Cove, shells burst overhead and machine gun and rifle fire slammed into the boats. They were not able to land the whole battalion until early hours of the next morning. Once grounded, Robert and his mates jumped clear, some disappearing into the deep water that saturated their clothes and their packs, several drowning, all while bullets, shrapnel, ripped across the beach. The men made their way up to Monash Valley and took up their positions. By nightfall, all 16,000 men had been landed, including Robert, and the ANZACs had formed a beachhead, although with several undefended sections. It stretched along Bolton's Ridge in the south across 400 Plateau to Monash Valley. After a short gap, it resumed at Pope's Hill and then at the top of Walker's Ridge. It was not a large beachhead. It was under 3 kilometres in length with a depth around 720 metres, and in places only a few yards separated the two sides. On the morning of the 26th of April, Major Wallace Ellis, the 2IC 13th Battalion, ordered 50 men to secure the opposite ridge. It is not known if Robert was one of the 50 sprinting across open ground as bullets whistled by the men secured the position, which became known as Pope's Hill. The 13th Battalion was now in the thick of the fight, passing scores of dead and wounded Australians and New Zealanders and encountering plenty of shrapnel and bullets. Robert and the 13th spent the 26th of April digging and fortifying trenches that had been newly won and holding off strong Turkish counterattacks. From the dawn of the 27th, sunlight revealed the carnage around the 13th. No doubt Robert would have had very little sleep and woke to the sounds of rifle fire and shrapnel and the stench of dead ANZAC and Turkish soldiers. That morning, Lieutenant Harold Watkins led a bayonet charge against the advancing Turkish troops, who, as a result, turned and fled. However, Lieutenant Watkins died along with his men, the first of the 13th Battalion to fall. All afternoon until long after dark, the Turks continued their heavy fire and assembling large numbers of troops in the dead ground just beyond the 13th Battalion front line. The 13th and Robert continued to face wave after wave of Turkish charges, and each time they were repulsed. All day, the 13th Battalion, like the Turks, threatened and charged. Most of the charges that were being organised and carried out on the spot by company and platoon commanders, all ranks showing the greatest initiative and daring in clearing in front of the enemy with a bayonet. Our casualties were unfortunately again heavy. However, the Turks were driven back in confusion, but their machine gunners from well-protected positions suddenly opened with terrible effect against the men of the 13th Battalion. The men were also constantly being sniped by the skilled Turkish snipers hiding in the gullies amongst the scrub. Throughout the day, the 13th continually attacked Turkish trenches. Newly landed reinforcements were hurried up from the beach and hurled straight into the fray anywhere required, several 13th officers finding themselves in charge of New Zealanders as well as their own troops. And so it was during one of these heroic charges attempting to capture enemy trenches that Robert Cooper Greenaway was killed, possibly by machine gun fire, shrapnel, or from sniper fire from well-hidden Turkish positions. Unfortunately, like many of his mates, his body was never recovered because of the chaos of the fighting and its intensity. Private Robert Cooper Greenaway is commemorated at Lone Pine. The memorial commemorates the 3,268 Australians and 456 New Zealanders who have no known grave, and the 960 Australians and 252 New Zealanders who were buried at sea after evacuation through wounds and disease. The memorial stands over the centre of the Turkish trenches and tunnels which were the scene of heavy fighting during the August offensive. During the course of the war 1915 to 1918, the 13th Battalion lost 1,090 men killed and 2,128 wounded. Going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.